There are loads of good focal lengths for portraits, and today we're going to talk about why you might use each one and which one's going to be best for you, especially if you're only going to be buying one prime lens. Which one do you want to get? Let's get into it. It's Tutorial Tuesday. Welcome back to Tutorial Tuesday, where each and every Tuesday, we bring you a brand new, fresh photography tutorial. This week, of course, we're talking about portrait photography, and we're talking about focal length. Now, we're going to be looking at prime lenses. Zoom lenses work well as well, but we'll actually talk about that in a different video. Today, we're looking at what focal length is going to work best for you. And we're going to look at three focal lengths in particular: 35mm, 50mm, and 85mm. Now, of course, there's other focal lengths that work well. 135 is actually really nice, but we're going to stick to those three because they're probably the most popular focal lengths for portrait photography. So how do you go about choosing which one to use for your photo? Well, there's a lot of different things to consider. And the biggest one, I think, is what kind of story are you looking to tell with the photo? Because really, with photography, it's all about telling stories. And with the portrait, you're telling the story of the person. Now, we've talked a little bit about this in the past with 35mm and 85mm, but we're throwing 50mm in there as well. So let's start things off. Let's talk about 35mm. When do I use 35mm? And what do I use it for? Well, this is obviously a wider focal length than your kind of traditional 50 and 85mm. I think it works really, really well, especially for an environmental portrait. Because it's wider, you're generally going to get a little bit more of the environment into your photo. The background is going to be a bit kind of wider. You're going to have more of it in there. So you can be able to see more of what is around your subject. It definitely becomes about where they are. So if the story you're trying to tell is about someone and it's what they do, let's say for a living, or it's where they live or something like that, a 35mm lens is going to be able to capture that really, really well. There's going to be less separation between the subject and the background than you would get with a 50mm or an 85mm. So they're kind of more gelled in there with their surroundings. You have more of that in the photo. And generally speaking, the bokeh is probably going to be less blurred, even if you're shooting wide open at f1.4, f1.8, anything like that, than it would be on something like an 85mm. You've got less compression. You also probably don't want to get too close to your subject. Of course, with a 35mm, it's not super wide, but you can get a bit of distortion if you get in too close. You know, if you get really close in, then things on the outside of the photo, outside of the frame, can start looking really big and unnatural. So you probably want to pull away a little bit, which again leads into having kind of more of the surrounding in the photo. This can be a great way of showcasing people actually doing things as well. So rather than a face-on kind of headshot or just a face-on portrait, you can get people actually doing things. Because you get more of the environment in there, it can work fantastically for that as well. Of course, it does also work well if you have less space to actually photograph. It's going to work fantastically because you are having that much wider field of view. Now let's compare that straight to an 85mm. We'll get to 50mm in a second, but with the 85mm, you're much more zoomed in. You know, it's much more about the subject as opposed to the surrounding. So what I said in the video from last year is 35mm is about where they are versus 85mm, which is about who they are. You get much more separation between the subject and the background. You get more of a blurred background because of the compression. You know, you have to pull away further from the subject to get them all in shot, otherwise you're going to get a much closer shot of them. And that can work really well. And like I say, if you're shooting wide open, especially f1.4, f1.8, you're going to get really nice separation from your subject and your background. Now, what that means is you can really tell a story here about who this person is. It's about them rather than where they are or what they're doing. And this is about them as a person and the story of them. So this is a much more personal focal length, I think. Now, personally for me, this is actually my favorite focal length to use. I love shooting at 85mm. Sometimes you might want to stop down a bit just to remove quite so much blur from that background, get a little bit more depth of field there, but I just love the look of an 85mm focal length. And that I think is because it's a very personal focal length. It's right up close with your subject and telling their story rather than the story of the whole frame. So just take this photo as an example. Even though I've pulled all the way back so I can get a full length shot of my model here walking down this alleyway with the camera, the photo is definitely all about her as opposed to the alleyway. I've done quite a full-on edit to kind of try and accentuate the drama of this environment, but because it's 85mm, this definitely feels like it's all about her. Whereas if I'd shot this on a 35mm lens, it would feel much more about the environment and the actual environmental portrait of it rather than a portrait of her walking down this alleyway. Now, this can be great for capturing moments as well. So let's say you're doing an event or a wedding or anything like that. 85mm allows you to get a little bit up close and personal with your subject, capturing just a lovely moment, a beautiful moment, someone laughing, sharing a moment with someone else, anything like that. 35mm is fantastic for getting some slightly wider shots, some kind of group shots, maybe dancing shots, all that kind of stuff. But 85mm will let you get personal with your subjects and get some of those more personal portraits. So where does that leave us with 50mm? Well, this is probably a little bit obvious, but it's kind of a little bit of a best of both worlds without really going into either. I love shooting on a 50mm because it's so versatile. I can get up close personal shots, but I can also pull back and get a shot including the surroundings. So this shot, for example, actually of me, is shot on a 50mm lens, which means I'm able to control my environment a little bit more than 35mm. I'm able to get a little bit of a depth of field there, but I'm still including the environment in the shot. So this photo definitely feels like it's a photo about me, maybe not quite as personal as an 85mm shot, but still with enough surrounding, but without going so overboard with a 35mm where it would be really about where I am as well. This shot's similar sort of situation. We're able to frame the shot with the surroundings, but the shot is absolutely still about our model here. I will always go 50mm if I'm only taking one lens, or if I'm going to be in a situation where I'm not going to be able to change lenses really that easily or that often. 50mm is going to let me get the personal shots, the slightly wider shots. It's going to really allow me to be more versatile with what I'm doing. So I generally recommend to people, if you haven't got a prime lens, if you're going to go for your first prime lens, you want to shoot portraits or anything like that, 50mm is the one, because you're going to be able to do so many different things and you're going to move around a lot to get those different photos, which means later, if you end up with a 35 or an 85mm, you're going to be used to moving around a lot. You're going to be used to framing things up differently, and it's going to be much easier to transition into those other focal lengths. But 50mm, whoo, that allows you some really beautiful stuff. And the versatility is huge. Something else that is worth talking about with all three of these lenses is how much control you have over the background. Because of course, with a 35mm, like we're talking about, you are going to have more of the background in view. If you take the same shot of the same person, trying to keep them the same size in the frame between 35, 50, and 85, the background is going to change a lot. And that's just because of the length of the focal length and how far away from the subject you need to be to keep them the same size in the shot. So with an 85mm, for example, you can control that background really, really well, because you only have to have a small amount of decent looking background for the shot to work. Whereas 35mm, you're going to need more of the background to look kind of decent or okay, or avoid things that don't look very good, because you're getting way more of that background in shot. 50mm, of course, again, kind of plays it in the middle. You're getting a decent amount of background. Again, let's throw that shot of me up there, partially because I like it, partially because I like the shot. Let's throw that shot up again. I've got enough of the background to kind of show where I am, a bit of surrounding, give a little bit of tonal context to the photo, but not so much that it's distracting or that I have to actually worry about moving things around or moving myself or moving in closer to actually kind of change the background a little bit, try and work that background. So 85mm is much easier to control the background. 35mm, you've got to think about it a little bit more. And 50mm right down the middle of those kind of two things. And I think that's important to consider as well. If you're taking a photo in a forest, for example, some of these photos, at 85mm, it's way easier to get a decent looking background than it is at 35mm, because you're having to think less about the actual background and the surroundings when you're shooting at a longer focal length. So what is your favorite focal length for shooting portraits? I'd love to hear down in the comments. Like I say, I think mine is probably 85mm, but I could definitely hear a case for 50mm. I do enjoy 35, of course. I do shoot 35 quite a bit, actually. But I think I like that longer focal length. I like the depth of field, the compression you can get from it, and all that kind of stuff. But I'd love to hear your favorite down in the comments. Of course, there's a list of all the kit used for these photos and this video down in the description, so you can check that out as well. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. I will, of course, see you in the next video. And as always, thanks for watching.